The mediums of the 19th century, who claimed to summon spirits, were actually laying the groundwork for a modern literary crime. What belief or tradition from history surprises you the most? Because their automatic writing sessions became the inspiration for the psychological blueprint an author used to copy the genius of a dead colleague. The literary world has its ghosts. They are the melancholy monuments to art's infinite potential, like unfinished symphonies, lost film reels, and half-finished statues. But none had ever cast a shadow as large as Alistair Finch's unfinished masterpiece, The Glass Labyrinth. In the early 20th century, as the world convulsed with the collapse of old empires and the painful birth of modernism, Finch had created a work that navigated the very limits of language and human psychology. The novel was the story of a man trying to find his way through a shattered consciousness, through memories and delusions, its sentences twisted like the corridors of a maze, its paragraphs linked by the illogical yet mesmerizing transitions of a dream. He was not merely telling a story. He was constructing a mental architecture with words. However, before he could place the final stone of this architecture, Finch departed from this world in his early 30s, leaving behind only a legend and one of the greatest what-ifs in literary history. The Glass Labyrinth, even with its final chapter missing, was a revolution upon its publication. But that absence created a cult around the work. For decades, the brightest academics and the most talented writers produced theories about what that final chapter might have been. Some even dared to write their own versions, but they all amounted to nothing more than pale imitations. Finch's style was as unique as a fingerprint. The mathematics of his words, the music of his sentences was so personal that to copy it seemed as impossible as copying another person's soul. The Glass Labyrinth was sealed as an unfinished masterpiece, becoming one of literature's sacred relics. Until 100 years later, at a moment no one expected, that seal was broken. The news broke first in whispers, then on literary blogs, and finally in the headlines of the world's most prestigious newspapers. The Glass Labyrinth, the final chapter, was being published, and its author was not Alistair Finch. Its author was a young, enigmatic man in his 20s, hitherto unknown, named Leo Carver. The literary world let out a collective sardonic laugh. This could not be more than an arrogant young man's brazen search for fame. The boy with no name had achieved what no one had been able to do for a century? As the book was published, the critics waited, their knives sharpened, to punish this hubris. But when they began to read, the laughter died. Sardonicism gave way to astonishment, and astonishment to an admiration that bordered on fear. This was not an imitation, it was an echo, a perfect echo from 100 years ago. Leo Carver had not only brought the story to a logical and satisfying conclusion, but he seemed to have captured the very soul of Finch. The choice of words, those strange but perfect metaphors, the hypnotic rhythm of the sentences, that ruthless honesty in delving into the depths of the character's consciousness, everything was there. It was as if Finch had risen from his grave and used this young man's body to complete his work. Even the most skeptical academics were silenced when they subjected the text to computer analysis. The algorithms showed that the statistical and stylistic fingerprint of the text matched Alistair Finch's known works with a 99% probability. It was, scientifically, a miracle. And so, Leo Carver became a legend overnight. But he accepted this fame not with the confidence of a genius, but with the humility of a conduit. In his first interview with one of the world's largest television networks, he made that unforgettable statement. With a sensitive, almost fragile voice, he looked into the eyes of millions of viewers and said, "I am not a writer. I am just a listener." Alistair Finch wanted to finish his story, and for some reason, he chose me. At night, as I sit in my room, I hear his voice. He dictates. I write. This book is not mine. It is his. The world fell in love with this story. In an age ruled by rationality and technology, people wanted to believe in this romantic, supernatural narrative. Leo Carver was not a writer. He was a modern-day prophet, a medium. The book sold millions at an unprecedented rate. Leo became an untouchable, almost sacred figure. He had seen the ghost of literature and had spoken with him. But not everyone was participating in this séance. Beyond the enthusiastic applause of the crowd and the adoring whispers of the media, there was one person watching, listening, and doubting. Forensic psychologist Dr. Eleonora Nora Vance did not believe in ghosts. She believed in the dark and complex labyrinths of the human mind, in the infinite potential for deception and self-deception. And in Leo Carver's eyes, she saw not the wisdom of a ghost, but the weight of something far more worldly, far more dangerous, the fatigue of a perfectly executed performance. For Nora, this was not a miracle. This was the most audacious, most intelligently constructed intellectual crime in history, and she swore to prove it. Dr. Nora Vance's office was a reflection of her mind, orderly, sharp, and uncompromising. On the walls hung framed portraits of famous literary forgers, Thomas Chatterton, Clifford Irving. On her shelves, books on psychology, linguistics, and criminology were arranged with military precision. Nora used science as a scalpel to understand the darkest motivations of the human soul. And the case of Leo Carver was an irresistible puzzle for her. She watched his television interview over and over again. She analyzed the young man's every gesture, every pause, every flicker of his eyes. Where others saw sincerity and humility, Nora saw a masterfully rehearsed performance. The distant, far-off look in Leo's eyes as he spoke of Finch's spirit was not that of someone trying to recall a memory, but the concentration of an actor trying to stay in a complex character. "Ghosts don't leave evidence, Nora," her colleague had said, seeing her obsession. "This is a matter of faith." "No," Nora had replied, her eyes glued to the screen. "This is a matter of method, and every method leaves a trace." Nora began a seemingly impossible task. She put not Leo Carver, but the man he claimed to be imitating, Alistair Finch, on the autopsy table. But this was not a medical autopsy. It was a psychological one. She went beyond Finch's published works. From university archives, private collectors, and Finch's surviving distant relatives, she collected every piece of paper, every scribble, every letter that belonged to him. She did not want to understand what Finch wrote, but how he thought. After months of this meticulous research, she discovered an obsession deep in Finch's personality, unknown to the public. Finch was not just a modernist writer. He was a passionate researcher of the 19th century spiritualism and the psychic phenomena of that era. He was particularly fascinated by the automatic writing sessions, where mediums would enter a trance and allegedly write uncontrollably. Finch's journals were filled with long and fervent passages, questioning whether this phenomenon was a channel for supernatural communication or a gateway to a yet undiscovered layer of human consciousness. This was the first crack Nora was looking for.
This could be the origin of Leo's ghost story. This was not just an inspiration, it was a handbook. Nora shifted her research to the strange and deceptive world of the 19th century. She studied the psychological mechanisms behind the spirit-summoning seances, the flying tables in dark rooms, and the talking boards. She read countless exposé texts that showed how the mediums of that era were in fact master manipulators, virtuosos of cold reading techniques and the art of directing human expectations. And she solved the secret of automatic writing. It was not about talking to the dead. It was about the living. It was a kind of self-hypnosis technique which allowed one to set aside the critical filter of the conscious mind and let the subconscious or another deeply learned personality control the movements of the hand. It was less a spirit-summoning seance and more a method-acting exercise. An actor would study the character's past, motivations, everything to get into the role. These automatic writers internalize the personality, the writings, everything about the spirit they were supposedly channeling, or rather the spirit they claimed to be channeling so deeply that they could eventually write like them. Nora looked at a photograph on her desk of a text allegedly written by a 19th century medium through automatic writing. Meaningless scribbles and childish drawings. Then she looked at a page from Leo Carver's final chapter of The Glass Labyrinth, the pinnacle of literary genius. The difference was talent and dedication. The mediums were fooling crowds with simple tricks, but what if a genius used the same technique to recreate the work of another genius?
Nora's theory crystallized in her mind at that moment. Leo Carver did not have a supernatural talent. He was the captive of an obsession. He had dedicated years, perhaps a decade, to building a mental copy of Alastair Finch inside his own brain. He had memorized his every letter, felt the rhythm of his every sentence, analyzed the psychological reason behind his every word choice. And then, using that old forgotten spiritualist technique, he had pushed aside his own consciousness and let that Finch ghost within him write. It was not a ghost dictating to him. It was him becoming a ghost himself. Now Nora had a theory, but the world did not believe in theories. It believed in proof. And to find that proof, she had to delve into the depths of Leo Carver's past. The official biographies wrote that Leo Carver had led a reclusive life, was homeschooled, and had no connection to the literary world until he published his first book. It was a carefully crafted story that reinforced his image as a pure conduit. But Nora never believed in official stories. With weeks of meticulous research, through private investigators and archive scans, she began to scratch the veneer off that perfect story. And underneath, she found what she was looking for. For the past 8 years, Leo Carver had worked as a low-level, unnoticed archive assistant at Princeton University's Firestone Library, the very library where all of Alastair Finch's personal papers, handwritten notes, letters, and journals had been donated. His job was to digitize and catalog Finch's documents. He had more access than anyone else, not just to Finch's works, but to the most intimate corners of his soul, from his scribbled shopping lists to his unpublished poetry drafts. This was the opportunity. This was the fuel for the method. Leo had spent years, like a monk, memorizing sacred texts, copying every piece of Finch's mind into his own. He was not just a fan, he was a student, and his master was a dead man. Now Nora had the opportunity and the method. All that was left was the confrontation. And this confrontation had to happen where Leo's legend was born, in front of millions.
Despite incredible media pressure and resistance from Finch's publisher, Nora secured the right to a 1-hour special interview with Leo Carver on live television. It was marketed as a battle between the skeptical scientist and the mystical writer, a war between reason and faith. On the night of the broadcast, the atmosphere in the studio was electric. Leo was there, as usual, calm, humble, with that fragile aura of someone who seemed to have come from another world. Nora, on the other hand, was cold, focused, and filled with the patience of a hunter. The first half of the interview went exactly as everyone expected. Nora asked questions about the most complex, most obscure themes in Finch's work. These were questions that only the most expert academics could answer, questions buried deep in the text. Leo answered each one without a moment's hesitation, with incredible clarity and depth. But his answers did not begin with, "I think," or "in my interpretation." He would say, "Alistair was feeling this at the time," or "his purpose was to show the silence behind the words," as if the author himself were speaking. The audience and even the studio crew were mesmerized. The feeling that Nora could not corner him, that this phenomenon was real, spread through the studio. But Nora was only setting the stage. As they entered the last 10 minutes of the interview, Nora took out a piece of paper from her notes. "Mr. Carver," she said, her voice calm but sharp, "last week, a previously unknown lost journal of Alistair Finch surfaced in a private collection. His publisher has given me special permission to share a short passage from this journal with you." For a moment, a faint flicker of curiosity appeared in Leo's eyes. This was a variable that was not in his plan. Nora began to read. The passage was a perfect copy of Finch's style, the same melancholy, the same complex sentence structure, the same unexpected but perfect metaphors. The passage described a previously unknown memory from the childhood of the main character in The Glass Labyrinth. When Nora finished reading, there was an absolute silence in the studio. She fixed her eyes on Leo. "What do you think of this newly found passage?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. "What is Finch trying to tell us here?" This was the trap, because there was no journal. That passage had been written specifically for this moment by Nora and a team of linguistic experts, imitating Finch's style. A real medium could not interpret a text that did not exist. A ghost could not explain something it did not write. But someone who had built a mental copy of Alistair Finch in his own brain, who had learned to think like him, feel like him, and write like him, he could. And Leo fell into the trap. He closed his eyes, pretending for a moment to be listening to Finch. Then he opened his eyes and began to speak. He analyzed the passage with incredible competence, as if he had written it himself. He explained how the character's childhood trauma affected his behavior in the later parts of the novel, how that metaphor was actually a reference to the author's relationship with his own father. Everything. He was not just interpreting, he was creating a new reality in Finch's name. And in that moment, in front of millions, his mask fell. Nora did not interrupt him. She waited for him to finish. And when Leo fell silent, Nora calmly said, "That's very impressive, Mr. Carver, especially considering that journal and that passage have never existed." The silence in the studio this time was filled with shock and realization. Leo Carver's face turned white as a sheet. At that moment, he was no longer a medium, he was a magician who had been caught. What followed was a collapse. After the show, Leo confessed everything. But he did not see himself as a fraud. He told the police, "I am a method writer. Just as an actor embodies a role, I embodied Finch's mind. I went so deep that at some point I did not know where I ended and he began. This was not a trick. This was art." The literary world was divided. Was Leo a fraud or the pioneer of a new art form? Was the book still a masterpiece, regardless of the author's intent? These questions were debated for months, for years. Nora Vance, meanwhile, sat in her chair in her office, looking at a photograph of a meaningless text scribbled by a 19th century medium through automatic writing. She pondered the strange irony of how one of the most bizarre deceptions in history had inspired one of the greatest literary achievements. The past, it seemed, didn't just tell stories. Sometimes it also whispered the methods for telling the most audacious lies. Can the deceptions of the past inspire the greatest works of art today? Or must genius always be honest? For more stories like this that challenge the boundaries of art and psychology, don't forget to subscribe to Parallel Storylines. See you in the next case file.